Hello, this is John Ricciuti, and today on Meet the Author, we have a very special guest. We've been invited to Ardrossan Estate by the author of the book, David Nelson Wren. This is a particularly exciting moment for me because I met David earlier in a bookstore and we had a conversation about the big house. And I'm very fortunate to have David as our guest today on Mainline Public Television. David, thank you for taking the time. I'm always fascinated about who built the big house.
Yes, well, the house was designed in 1911 by Horace Trumbauer, who was an architect really loved by society for his grand houses. He designed White Marsh Hall in Philadelphia, several of the houses in Newport, and so it was a given that the Montgomerys would engage him to build their home. The house interior rooms on the first floor here were all done by White Alum, and White Alum was a British design firm, and they had an office in New York City. And White Alum designed the first floor rooms at the Henry Clay Frick House, which is now the Frick Museum in New York. They were also known for some of the rooms at Buckingham Palace. However, the Montgomerys wanted everything with a quality unsurpassed, but as plain and simple as could be. They did not want anything gilded or grandiose in any way. They wanted a typical English country home in the Philadelphia suburbs. The same people who built the Capitol building in Harrisburg worked on this house. Some of the furniture is our family heirlooms, but a lot of this furniture came through White Alum. The sofa in which you're sitting on was made by White Alum and shipped here, just the frame, and then covered once it passed through customs. Colonel Montgomery had a great lineage, but he was not from tremendous wealth. He was a very intellectual man, and very good with money. He and Mrs. Montgomery, she was Charlotte Hope Benny Tyler, shared a mutual great-grandfather in Horace Benny, so they were second cousins. And the Tylers always had amassed great wealth, and but when the Colonel married Miss Tyler, he started a brokerage firm, his own brokerage firm, and within 10 years of starting the firm, it was a huge success, and he had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange.
Your book it's brilliant. It's a book that satisfies someone with architectural tastes, with historical tastes. It's probably the best coffee table book I've ever put in my house. Where did you get all the passion to write that book?
Well, I think that a person has to fall in love. I was here in the house many times before the idea of a book came about, and I always marveled at the house. I was the one guest that they had that gawked at everything. I just thought it was a splendid place. And in 1997, Robert Montgomery Scott, who was at the time living in an apartment on the third floor here, invited friends over to watch the Belmont Stakes and on television. And during the afternoon, the idea of the book came about, and he was not too keen on a book because I don't think initially he understood what we would include and what we wouldn't include. And it was actually Walter Annenberg, who was among the guests, who encouraged him to pursue the idea of a book with me. And when we started it, it was strictly a decorative arts book and an architecture book. We were only discussing how the house was made and built and decorated. And then after Bob's death, I was encouraged by members of the family to keep pursuing it. And that's when Bob's cousin Joan Mackey championed the project and said that she really wanted the book finished, but it also had to be about the family, because obviously a house is, it sounds very trite, but a house is a home only because of the people that live in it. So I was then given access to the family archive and read their letters and diaries and journals, and really fell in love with the people themselves, although not still here with us on the earth, but the people that I wrote about in the book, I really became fascinated with their lives. So it became a love affair, quite simply, you know? And so I was compelled along by that passion. The Montgomerys were always interested in genealogy and in their ancestry. Mrs. Montgomery's aunt, Helen Beach Tyler, was a genealogist first rate. Like any English country house with family portraiture, they became interested in collecting it. And so it was an interesting fact that the inherited pieces were then mixed with pieces that they bought, and friends of theirs would, in a couple of cases, found paintings that were of their ancestors and made them gifts. It was an interesting dynamic in the family archive, because they saved literally every imaginable document, and they were great letter writers. So for example, in how we determined how the house was built, the Colonel kept every letter from Horace Trumbauer and every letter from White Alum, but he also kept a carbon of everything he sent back to them, and it was all filed from in reverse chronological order, so it's almost as if you're reading emails. You know, there's a chain of letters back and forth. And that was also back in a day when the mail came twice a day. You know, you had a morning and an evening delivery. So it's interesting to me, too, to note that some of these letters are dated, you know, one day after the other. And there's quite a collection of documentation. I came here pretty much at first light and stayed until dusk in a former linen room on the 3rd floor and read all of it. It took several years, because all of the correspondence from their business dealings with Andrew Carnegie, right down to letters back and forth between the Scotts and Katharine Hepburn regarding the Philadelphia story, all of that is retained by the family. The Philadelphia story is, of course, fiction, but Philip Barry was a friend of Edgar Scott's. They met. Philip Barry, funny story, when Hope Scott and I talked about the Philadelphia story, she said that her husband knew Philip Barry because they were roommates in college. And then I started working on the book, which was, of course, after her death, and I've discovered that Philip Barry went to Yale and Edgar went to Harvard. So I laugh at that story still, because how can you possibly be roommates and go to 2 separate universities? But there was a summer playwriting class at Harvard, and Philip Barry went to Harvard for the summer to study playwriting, and that's where he and Edgar met. So, you know, writers write about what they know or should, and so Philip Barry was entertained here many, many times. He loved Miss Tyler, Mrs. Montgomery's aunt, and all of the family, and he based his play on this house. A lot of the play takes place on the terrace, as it does also in the film. I like to think that the terrace and the whole house was really what he had in mind. If you see the play or read the play, it's very specific. It talks about Radnor, it talks about Bryn Mawr College, it talks about, there's a lot of references that people would know locally. But when the play was turned into a film, it was made much more generic, and all of that was eliminated.
I would be willing to bet that they must have had grand parties here. the Elkins, the Biddles, the Wideners. They were all here.
The house really was built for parties. It really lends itself to parties, and the Montgomerys hosted many, many parties here. You mentioned the Elkins. Sidney Tyler remarried out of Elkins. So the Elkins were actually then related to the Montgomerys through his marriage. And yes, they were all entertained here, and the Montgomerys were entertained at their homes. Linwood Hall and where the Wideners lived, and they shared mutual friends and entertained mutual friends. And one of the stories in the book was about Mary Garden, who was a Scottish opera singer, and she was friends of both families. She stayed at Linwood Hall, but she came over to Ardrossan during her visits to see the Montgomerys. And the Montgomerys also were very social with their children, in the sense that the house hosted many debutante balls. Mrs. Montgomery, after the Colonel died, gave coming out parties for all of her granddaughters here. And of course, wedding receptions. And the house has actually been the scene of several funerals. Both Colonel and Mrs. Montgomery's funerals were here in this house. So it's, as was Sidney Tyler's funeral. So it's been a family home in every sense of the word. It certainly was the last large property, and also the last house lived in by the original family. Certainly as far as Horace Trumbauer houses go. You know, it needed to be documented in a book. The Gold Coast, I suppose, on Long Island would be considered like the main line, but it's its own very unique place. There's a great story about, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but a Philadelphia debutante being presented to Queen Mary. And of course, Queen Elizabeth put an end to all of the debutante presentations, but for years, debutantes and young married women were presented at court. And one of the Philadelphia debutantes is supposed to have come up from her curtsy to the Queen, and the Queen asked, "And where do you come from, my dear?" And to which the young woman replied, "Why, the main line, Your Majesty," as if it was its own principality, you know. So not Philadelphia, not Pennsylvania, but, oh, the main line. So in that day and age, I think, too, it was its heyday, its glory days, and it became part of our pop culture in the sense that Hollywood went crazy for the main line, not just because of the Philadelphia story, but the Young Philadelphians, Kitty Foyle, which won the Oscar for Ginger Rogers the same year that Philadelphia Story came out. All of those films glamorize the main line. So it's forefront in our culture. The Montgomerys were known for their prize herd of Ayrshires and their dairy production here. And, you know, when you think of Ardrossan, you have to think of cows. The family dairy business stopped its own milk routes in the 1950s and started selling the milk to Wawa. So if you drank Wawa milk in the late 50s and 60s and into the 70s, you may very well have been drinking Ardrossan milk.
Blue blood milk.
That's right.
How many in service, I don't want to use the word service, in service people, folks worked here?
There were 12 live-in, but others that lived on the property included 3 chauffeurs. The Colonel would buy 3 cars exactly alike. One for himself, one for Mrs. Montgomery, and one for Miss Tyler. And they did not share chauffeurs. They had 3 chauffeurs, each for their own and automobile. And then, of course, the Colonel had a valet, and both Mrs. Montgomery and Miss Tyler had ladies' maids. So they lived here in the house. and there was, of course, a full-time butler. The Montgomerys were one of the last of the mainline families, actually one of the last Philadelphia families to keep a butler. Although in the waning years of butlers, they shared the one butler with several of the houses on the estate.
During the First World War, many of the houses, estates in England and Scotland were used for rest and recuperation. I know the United States got into World War I in 1917, and the war was ended in 1918. Was this facility ever used in any capacity in World War I?
It was not used like that in World War I. However, and the colonel did serve in an administrative position during World War I in Washington, and they rented a house there, and were back and forth. But I must say that World War II certainly made big changes here at Ardrossan. They were afraid of German bombers here in Philadelphia, so the house was outfitted with blackout curtains, and also the basement here was, and the wine cellars were designated as a fallout shelter. Edgar Scott was the air raid warden for Radnor Township, and so World War II, certainly, they closed Murray House, which is another one of the houses on the property, and Alexander Montgomery's family moved into the third floor, and also the branch of the family in England came over for a time to avoid the Blitz over there and lived in this house. So it was certainly, World War II certainly had a larger impact on Ardrossan than one did.
How many houses are on the estate?
Approximately 30, and that includes the houses that were built for the people that worked on the property, because you had a working dairy here, so you had a farm manager, you had a herdsman, you had a groom at the stable. The property was quite immense. It went from Church Road to Godfrey Road and one direction, and then to Darby Paoli the other way. So it encompassed 750 some odd acres at its height. Well, it's really actually in the heart of Ithan, and oddly, because you don't drive through Ithan now and you don't realize, but it's the center of Radnor Township, and at one time was quite a metropolis of sorts. Of course, it's not right on the railroad, so it lost a little bit of its zip. But at one time, the family had an Ithan post office address, so it was Ardrossan, Ithan, Pennsylvania. But and now it's certainly considered Villanova.
You mentioned horses here. Was that all part of the Devon Horse Show as well?
Two of the Montgomery's daughters, Helen Hope Montgomery Scott and Charlotte Ives Montgomery, were riders and champion horsewomen. I think that it should be pointed out that, yes, they did ride at Devon, and Hope did serve as the president of the horse show for a time, or chairman of the horse show committee, but it was Ives, Charlotte Ives, who was the national champion. I mean, she jumped in many horse shows all around the country. And they had a stable of jumpers and hunters, because obviously they needed the hunters for fox hunting. And so yes, the colonel had quite a major stable here on the property.
You researched countless hours. Do you think from your research to the present that Ardrossan has lost any of its charm?
It hasn't lost any of its charm for me, but it certainly is evolving. It's no longer the massive estate that it once was. But of course, that's happening everywhere. You know, we need more property for development, and certainly our world is expanding, and people don't live in a grand fashion like this anymore with 12 live-in servants. I mean, it's just not the way people live. We live less formally, but it still has charm to me. It's a very enchanting place.
Doing the research that you did on the house and going through the letters, I would have found myself immersed back in time for that period. Did that happen with you?
Absolutely, especially when reading their travel logs. It was really fascinating because the Colonel and Mrs. Montgomery believed that travel was key to educating their children. And even though they were schooled here with a governess, they were world travelers, and they traveled absolutely everywhere. Before they went to Egypt, they learned about Egypt, and then, of course, when they were there, they made copious notes and documented all of their travels. So it was interesting to me to read not just about those places, but about traveling to them in those times in the 1920s, or right after World War I, and really fascinating travel logs made by everybody in the family.
And you would just probably sometimes just read a letter and just be locked on it.
Locked on it is a good way to put it, but also a lot of humorous things. I came across a letter one day from Edith Roosevelt, who, of course, was the first lady of the country, and it was on her, I don't remember if it was White House stationery or if it was their Long Island estate, but Mrs. Roosevelt wrote to her cousin, Helen Beach Tyler, and said she was going to be in Philadelphia, and did she have a room she could put her up in at Ardrossan. And she hated to impose, and if the house was full of other guests and there wasn't any place for it, it was okay, she'd find a hotel room. And I just thought it amusing because it was coming from the first lady, a former first lady of the nation, that if you could please find a room to put me up in at Ardrossan, I would appreciate it.
You could probably write a book just on the letters, just on all the letters.
The letters should be kept and saved and documented. They're really quite fascinating.
Do you have the energy to do another book? Because this must have taken a countless amount of energy.
I'm thinking about other projects now. Mm-hmm.
How is it that Ardrossan has been able to last so long?
That's actually really simple to answer. Colonel and Mrs. Montgomery were very shrewd about preserving their family home, and they put it in trust. And the trust was to be not dissolve until 21 years after the death of the last child. So the estate was in trust for those children and their families all those years. And so there was no possibility of it being carved up.
You mentioned there were collectors, and one of the things that would probably interest me would be their wine cellar or their collection. Did they have a vast wine cellar?
Two. They built one initially, and then the Colonel decided that it was not big enough, and also it was not, the shelves didn't suit him. So instead of tearing it all out and starting over, he just added another one. And of course, Prohibition was something that they really worked around because the Colonel would also owned some rental properties here. And before he would rent to you, you had to tell him if you were wet or dry, meaning wet, I am not in favor of Prohibition. Dry, I'm for Prohibition. And he would not rent to anyone who was dry. Kind of an interesting way to discriminate.
I know if I talk to you long enough, you'll tell me more and more stories about a lot of things that went on.
Yeah, and it also was the very first bangs-free herd in Pennsylvania, and maybe in the United States. The Colonel was very, very much into experimentation of how to produce the most healthy milk and have the healthiest herd. If a cow ever wandered off from Ardrossan, it could not come back. It was not allowed back on the property. So he kept his cows as disease-free as was humanly possible, and became rated as the first dairy in Pennsylvania to be bangs-free.
What would you like your readers to experience that read your book?
I am hopeful that they will come away appreciating that it is a family of survivors. There are a lot of glorious things that happened here, but also it's a family that went through war and went through the Great Depression. The Colonel didn't make any money during the Depression. He said that he would feel guilty if he did. But he also didn't fire anyone because he knew that even though he was losing money, that the people that he let go could not get another job. So, being that it was in the Depression. So, I really hope that people will see the family as a family of survivors, and certainly take away joy from the book, and hopefully maybe learn a little something, you know.
Would you like to give credit to some of the people that helped you edit it, because it's so well done, the book. I can't say enough about it.
You know, it is definitely a team effort. A book like this does not come easily. From the day the contract was signed with the publisher, which is Bauer and Dean, they really took control of my schedule for 2 full years. It was very hands-on. They made 4 or 5 trips to Ardrossan, one to my home in upstate New York for a week or so of very heavy editing. The manuscript was a little over 100,000 words, and they wanted only 40,000, and we ultimately agreed on 60,000. So in a book like this, there's a line editor. Somebody reads it just for punctuation. Phil Graham at the Radnor Historical Society was absolutely marvelous. He answered daily emails from me. Of course, Tom Crane, who did the initial color photography, and then Steve Gunther, who did principal photography. Later, he's responsible for the cover shot. Tom did some remarkable things. There's a ha-ha wall on the estate. It's out the south lawn, and you cannot see it from the house, but the wall, ha-ha, keeps the cows from coming up onto the property. And it was an impossibility to photograph, and somehow Tom Crane was able to do it brilliantly. So there was a lot of back and forth, and I'm just very, very grateful that we had the team that we had. I was lucky that I didn't hear a lot of no. You know, everybody loved the place so much that they wanted to help in any way they could. So it's been a great ride.
Where's your book available?
It's at all Barnes and Noble stores, and it's in Philadelphia. On the main line, you can get it at Main Point, Valley Forge Flowers. It's available at Head House Books in Center City. It's really available at any bookstore. You can go in and request it. We're really thrilled that 255 copies have actually sold in London. So I was actually made aware that Prince Charles has a copy. So I'm really thrilled about that.
Well, it's certainly an honor to talk to you. What was the most shocking thing that you uncovered when you were going through doing your research?
On the household inventory was listed a Gainsborough painting, and nobody alive remembered the Gainsborough painting. So for a while we thought we had there was a missing Gainsborough, right? But we were able to locate it, and it's at the Mellon Museum at Yale. It had been sold unbeknownst to this current generation, some years back to Paul Mellon. So I think that was kind of an interesting thing to figure out where the missing art went.
Well, it was certainly a pleasure. I really enjoyed this time together. It was a wonderful interview.
My pleasure too. Thank you so much. There were 4 paintings here done by Sir John Lavery, and the painting in the middle of the south wall is Sidney F. Tyler, and he was Mrs. Montgomery's father. And the Laverys came here to paint the 4 commissions and ended up staying and painting a lot of people on the main line because they liked Ardrossan so much. Lady Lavery was an American. She was from Chicago, but she really loathed Americans. She thought them vulgar and tacky, and she hated coming back to America. So when she came to Ardrossan and liked it, Sir John Lavery said, "Can we just stay here and use the Ardrossan as our base?" So they ended up doing quite a few paintings of people in Radnor during that time. Lady Lavery, you might know because her image was on the Irish banknote for years and years. And of course she was rumored to have had an affair with Michael Collins, which I think, the Irish revolutionary, and I think that's been disproven now. But it was a very exciting time here at Ardrossan. This is Hope Montgomery Scott, and it's the second of 3 paintings painted of her. It was painted by Augustus John, and this particular painting is considered one of his masterpieces. Now this is Mary Benny Montgomery Wheeler, and this was painted in Paris by Zulaga. Obviously it's the largest painting in the house. And Zulaga was known for his portraits of European royals, and he really was not interested in painting what he thought was a Philadelphia dilettante. And there was a lot of negotiating back and forth, and he did not agree to paint the painting until he met his subject, and she charmed him. And she was a reluctant sitter, actually. She wasn't really interested in having her portrait done, and he initially not interested in painting it, and obviously it's one of the most magnificent in the house. And she was a member of the first class at the Curtis Institute. She was there for 4 years, and learned to play the piano, recorded with Leopold Stokowski, and with the Philadelphia Orchestra. She then formed her own dance company. She was really quite ahead of her time. She did quite a lot for modern dance in Philadelphia, was the choreographer for the Philadelphia Opera Company, and then really hadn't met the man of her dreams as yet, but wanted to be a mother. So she did something that women just didn't do in her day. She adopted first one and then a second daughter. And then it wasn't until a few years later that she met John Pierce Wheeler and fell in love, and then he adopted her daughters. And the life of Mary Benny is really really deserves its own book. After he died, she decided to focus on photography, and she became an accomplished photographer, and her collection of photographs of India and Sri Lanka are at the University of Pennsylvania, and it's the largest collection of its kind anywhere. The Mary Benny Wheeler image collection, if you Google it or look it up, it's really quite extraordinary, and you can listen to the sound of her voice narrate the photographs, talk about the photographs. This painting is a Halmy. It was painted. It was the first portrait of the family done this is Mrs. Montgomery. It was the first portrait brought here when the house was completed. It was begun before she was pregnant with her last child, and she was afraid that she was going to be showing. So they put a pedestal in front of her and a veil, a shawl, and then it was discontinued until after the last child was born, and then she resumed posing for it. This is the Montgomery's only son, Alexander Montgomery, and this was painted by William Orpin in London, and it was one of the last portraits that Orpin painted before his death. Orpin had been an illustrator and a World War I battlefield artist. They had such things then, and Alexander Montgomery was very, very interested in Orpin's work, and they really hit it off and became friends, the artist and the subject. This is Charlotte Ives Montgomery, and this was painted here in the house by Philippe de Laszlo, and de Laszlo absolutely hated being here because he couldn't get Ives off of her horse. She was not interested in having her portrait done at all. He took other commissions while he was here to fill his time, and ultimately ended up using Mrs. Montgomery to sit in for the torso. And as he mentions in his diary, one of her sisters, but does not name which one, for the hands. Finally, he was able to complete the portrait, and it too is considered by the de Laszlo archive as one of his masterpieces. What you should also take note of is when Mrs. Montgomery did the needlepoints. She needlepointed a lot of things, to include the sofas. This was completed in 1937, and there are her initials, Charlotte Hope Benny Tyler Montgomery. These are pretzel-back Chippendale chairs, quite rare, believed to have been made here in Philadelphia. This is a portrait of Mrs. Montgomery and her brother as children, obviously. This was actually copied from a photograph, which was kind of a thing that was done in that day and age. People would like a particular photograph and then have an artist paint it. This was done by Charles Morris Young. It's the Radnor Hunt on the south lawn of the property. It was done on Christmas Day. There was always a Christmas Day fox hunt here. Interesting about the Montgomerys, they go back to the very core of the nation in the sense that they were among the very earliest people in America, certainly the Mayflower Society and all of that that goes along with it. So in Philadelphia, through marriage, they are second cousins, Colonel and Mrs. Montgomery, and their mutual great-grandfather was Horace Binney, who is considered by many to be the father of Philadelphia law. I mean, he argued some very heady cases before the Supreme Court. In fact, was asked twice to be Chief Justice of our Supreme Court. This is Robert Wallen, and of course that name is also synonymous with Philadelphia hierarchy. The paintings in this room are some of the oldest ancestors of the Montgomerys, and that was in keeping with the English tradition of putting the ancestral portraits that were most prized in the dining room and or the library in English country houses.